Hey everybody, and welcome to this edition of Between the Weekends. This time we're looking at getting to know your church, and if you look behind me, what you will notice is an exit sign, and some of you have been behind that door, and some of you have not. Let's see what we might find. Well, as you can see, actually, we just find other doors and other passageways. Behind me is a door that, when opened, goes all the way down to the basement. To the right, of course, is a door which actually goes to the outside. But this morning, we're going to take a look at what is to my right, which is yet another passageway to another secret place. It seems this passageway is actually taking us on another journey. You can see the door to my right, which actually goes to the sanctuary, but what I'm really interested in sharing with you is what's just further around to the corner. Hang tight, we're almost there. Well, we have finally arrived. We have found our way into what is called the vestry. This is a room that is just off of the sanctuary. It also is adjacent to the outer doors, as you've noticed, and so sometimes it is referred to a vestibule as well. But a vestibule is not specifically a religious term. In fact, buildings such as government buildings and other places that have small rooms off to the left of the main area and adjacent to the doors are oftentimes called vestibules. The history of the term actually comes from ancient architecture when they weren't able to span the width of buildings because of their building abilities at those times, and so there would be other rows of columns close to the outside, and the vestibule would oftentimes be in between. But this is called a vestry in the church sense of the term because it has to do also with what you find behind me, the vestments. These specifically are robes that are used by our acolytes and also our assisting ministers. I could put my robe on back here as well, but I tend to keep it in my office closet and to get dressed there. But the vestments are coverings for the worship leaders. Now, in ancient days, the idea of this covering was that so the person who was leading worship might be presented as one who had been cleansed or ritually clean for the conducting of the various religious practices of the time. And in the modern days, it continues to have that symbolism with it as well. We're not quite as rigid on the purification rites and such that they used to be, but there is this idea of covering oneself up with essentially the clothing of Christ, because in the scriptures it talks about being clothed with Christ. Sometimes in a similar way, we place a pall over a funeral casket, and we talk of that person being clothed with Christ. It's as if we are putting a vestment over the casket and ultimately over the person found therein. A reminder that they belong to God and they are loved and cared for and in the arms of God. So the vestry has to do with the vestments, and they are in this place. They also have the kinds of things that help us prepare for worship. So I'm going to move over here for a second, and you can hear the dinging of the apparatus that is used for lighting the candles and also for extinguishing the candles. By the way, in my family, this is just a little idiosyncrasy, but in my family, we always talked about outening the candles. I know that's not a correct term. Extinguish is the proper term, but sometimes you'll hear me say outening the candles because I just grew up hearing that time and time again. But this particular device is used for that. You'll notice it has a wick that can extend out as necessary to light the candles. And back in here is where the acolytes gather with the assisting ministers and then also the pastor and or intern to prepare for worship. One of the things you might not be aware of is when we gather in this place, we take a few moments to prepare for the worship that is to follow, and one of us leads a prayer. Normally it is myself. And normally that prayer, though it varies each week in some respects, it basically usually includes a couple of common elements. It includes a thanksgiving for God allowing us to be the worship leaders. It offers thanksgiving for those who are coming to worship and prayers for them. And then it also offers thanksgiving to God for inviting all of us to worship in the first place. So we're praying for the worship leaders, we're praying for those who gather for worship, and we're giving thanks for what God has provided in the form of an invitation to worship at all. So those are some things we do that aren't seen by the general congregation. This room is not used very much on Saturday night worship, since we do not put vestments on at that time. In fact, that's kind of a common trend these days. There is the one school of thought in terms of covering oneself and not being overly focused on what one is wearing, but rather all having a somewhat uniform dress for those who are leading worship, and that certainly has its place. And then there's that other common component these days in terms of, and it's kind of in a backlash, I think, to a general distrust of institutions that has grown over time, especially since the 60s in the United States in particular. And so there's a bit of a movement toward the let's just be real, let's just be who we are. And the old idea of the song, Just As I Am, comes to mind in that regard. So on Saturday night, we don't actually use vestments. That's a little bit more along those lines. But the traditional service on Sunday mornings, we normally do use vestments because in that way of thinking, we tend to think a little bit more along the traditional lines. Either way, God welcomes us to worship and invites us to prepare for doing just that. And the vestry is the place where that oftentimes begins. Now, a couple of other little notes about this space. If you were to look over to my left, there is actually a small restroom here, so that can be handy at times for those who are preparing for worship. I'm going to do a little scanning with the camera here if I can. We'll pan over here. We've got a picture of the Lord's Supper, a little mirror for folks, an older crucifix that we had, or processional cross, I should say. Here's an old kneeling bench that is sometimes used for weddings, although I suspect that probably came from the previous church building, because although it is periodically used here at Zion, there really isn't very much room in the front of the sanctuary between the altar rail, as it were, and also the rest. Pardon me as I move the camera a little bit on the tripod, but we also have few old Bibles, and then little known things like the place for the matches or the bigger matchbox and this. And then just a little bit of trivia. This, of course, is the place where we light the candles. And you can see, if we pan up to the ceiling here a little bit, if my camera will get that high, yep, I believe it will, you will notice, see if I can zoom in, that somebody at some point got a little too close to the ceiling with their candle lighter apparatus, and so sometimes you have a little bit of excitement. By the way, we do have a little ladder here that goes up hither and yon into some of the air conditioning and heating work. So that is, in a nutshell, as I fall down here, a tour of the vestry, and an important room in the church that most people don't get a chance to visit very often, but it's a place that was especially prepared, essentially, to help people prepare for leading worship. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Between the Weekends, and I can't wait to share with you next week's interview, and the week after that, another opportunity to get to know your church. But next week, an interview and getting to know God's church. Thanks for tuning in again to this edition of Between the Weekends.